Recording. Very good. Thank you. All right, so we'll get started here. Welcome everyone to our Anthropology Pro Sem. We are so delighted today to have our colleague and faculty member in our Department of Anthropology, Dr. Barbara Roth. Dr. Roth received her bachelor's at the University of Colorado Boulder in journalism, and then shifted over to archaeology and got her MA and PhD at University of Arizona. And her dissertation was the late archaic settlement and subsistence in the Tucson Basin. She has a stunning 8 edited books. The most recent, 2021, The Agent of Change, the Deposition and Manipulation of Ash with Charles Adams. She also has a very recent 2019 book with our own Dr. Karen Hari, Interaction and Connectivity in the Greater Southwest, and also has her own book, 2016, actually an award-winning book, Agricultural Beginnings in the American Southwest, and also has a textbook before virtual really took off in 2002 with Harold Dibble on the virtual dig. Dr. Roth has an impressive 65, if I counted all of them, peer-reviewed articles and edited book chapters in many of our top journals, American Anthropologist. In fact, just coming out, the work that she's going to talk about today in the Mimbres River Valley, a lot of publications are coming out there, including a 2020 just released with our own alumna, Dr. Catherine Balshin, an American Anthropologist, The Situational Power in Cooperative Communities, Indications from Bioarchaeology in the Mimbres Regions. That just came out in American Anthropologist. She's also published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, American Antiquity, and also very top-rated regional journals, including Kiva, the Journal of California Archaeology, and North American Archaeologist. She's also produced 25 technical reports, of course, very important for archaeologists to have those technical reports with the really detailed information, and also has been an active, excellent grant getter, including National Science Foundation, U.S. Forest Service, quite active grant getter and actually $250,000 plus gotten through grants. She's also been the backbone of our field schools here at UNLV. Field schools are really the lifeblood for our training for our students, and Dr. Roth and Dr. Hari have really taken that on over the years to provide that service to our students and to our field. And she's had field schools for 4 seasons at the Elk Ridge site, which she's reporting on in the Mimbres River Valley in New Mexico, as well as 6 seasons at the Harris site in the Mimbres Valley region. So with no further ado, I'll cede the floor to my colleague, Dr. Barbara Roth, and she'll talk about the Elk Ridge community in the Mimbres Pueblo world. Barb, take it away.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you everybody for coming. I actually have 2 of my former field school students sitting in front of me, so I'm really happy to have you here. And I heard that Katie's on the call too. So what this illustrates first off is that none of this work that I'm going to report on today has been done in a vacuum by myself. It's always been a team effort. And so I have a great group of students and colleagues who have helped me along this journey. So since this is I was out of the department for 3 years, so I haven't given a pro sem in a long time. So since this is my foray back into giving pro sems, I thought that I would talk a little bit for the new students who I haven't really met a lot of you, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my kind of journey to get to the Elk Ridge site. And so as Dr. Frink just said, I started out working in the Tucson Basin on early agricultural sites. And so I really was interested in hunter-gatherers and how hunter-gatherers used landscapes. And so that was what my dissertation was on. I did a lot of field work. I was involved in the survey of the northern Tucson Basin, so we did a lot of field work. I don't know if Ian is on the call, but if he is, Ian, that's one of the agave roasting pits that we've been talking about. So we did some excavations there. And then this is my major professor who has really been a huge influence on my career, Dr. Paul Fish. We found early maize at one of the sites that we were digging during this process, and I then became interested in how hunter-gatherers adopted agriculture, and then went on to investigate that. I've worked a lot throughout my career with cultural resource management. I started doing cultural resource management when I was first out of grad school, and then continued to partner with cultural resource managers kind of throughout my career. And this is a site, an early agricultural site called Las Capas, which I did in partnership with SWCA. And that, of course, all of this led to the book that Dr. Frink talked about on early agricultural origins. During this time in 1992, I got asked, because of my interest in agriculture and the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, to come and work at the site of Lake Roberts, which is in the Mimbres, just outside the Mimbres Valley. It's between the Mimbres Valley and the Gila Valley. To come because it was a Pueblo site, but underneath the Pueblo was a pit house component that was thought to represent that transition that I was interested in, transition from hunting and gathering to farming. And so I went and excavated there at Lake Roberts. And then that led me to excavate another pit house site, which was located outside Silver City. So this is all in the Mimbres region of southern New Mexico. But all of these were away from the river. And so what we were finding was that transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture to sedentism was kind of a slow process in these areas away from the river, at both Lake Roberts and at La Gila and Cantada. And that kind of went against what was thought to be what was happening in the Mimbres River Valley. And so at that time, the Mimbres River Valley was well known for its Pueblo sites. The pit house component sites were best known from excavations that had been done in the 1930s by Emil Howry. And so we kept finding a different trajectory of change in these sites away from the river. And so after we finished Gila and Cantada, I thought, well, it's weird that we're not seeing the same process that they are in the Mimbres River Valley. So I need to go look at this in the Mimbres River Valley, and was very, very lucky to get permission to go and go into the Mimbres Valley and work, which is, again, best known for its black and white pottery and its very severely looted Pueblos. But I was able to go and work at the Harris site. I guess to summarize this very quickly and easily, it was like going from Pahrump to Las Vegas. Okay, the sites that we were digging were rural and were different. There was a different trajectory there because where the hub was the Mimbres River Valley. So we went to, started work at Harris in 2008, thinking that we would be there for a couple seasons, and finished in 2013. So we were there for a long, long time. We ended up excavating a large number of pit houses, lots of extramural features and kiva. and really kind of changed the way we thought about this transition. In these more rural, kind of Pahrump-like settings, the transition from hunting and gathering was slow, relatively paced, I guess you want to say. And then about AD 750 to 800, you saw them kind of buy into agriculture, become more sedentary, and that's not at all what we saw here. These guys came into the game ready to go. And so what we found during our excavations at Harris was that we had a community, a large community at its peak, probably about 200 people living there. And through our excavations, we really found that there were 3 levels of community organization. There were autonomous households, households that were probably just family groups. There were household clusters, which we interpreted as extended family corporate groups, and we linked this to irrigation agriculture, which they were not practicing in the more rural settings. And then you, of course, had the community, which was integrated through the use of large communal structures, or what we call great kivas. So I'm going to talk just really, since this talk is about Elk Ridge, I'm going to talk really briefly about this. But why I'm discussing this is because it does play into what we're seeing happen at Elk Ridge. And so we basically kind of built through time this idea of how these communities developed and what they might have looked like. And so we started that at Harris. I joke all the time because, as I say, I started doing archaic archaeology, early hunter-gatherers. Then I went to the Pitt House period. Elk Ridge is a large Pueblo. I figure by the end of my career, I'll be digging historic sites because I just keep going through time. So anyway, this is a snap of the Harris site. Harris was excavated by Emil Howry in the 1930s. Just to give you an idea of the difference in excavation techniques, Howry dug 34 houses in 1 season. We were there for 8 seasons, we dug 20. So a little bit different excavation techniques going on. But as you'll see from this map, there's a central plaza area of the site. It is surrounded by a series of sequentially used great kivas. So this was the central ritual part of the site. And then it's surrounded by these extended family corporate groups and then autonomous households. So that whole community came together really around this central ritual area. So what we've done through our work at Harris is we figured out that the extended family corporate groups were really the kind of lifeblood of this. They developed by the San Francisco phase, so around AD 7 to 750, and then expanded greatly during the Three Circle phase, which was really the height of the occupation of the Harris site, AD 800 to 950. That's when you wanted to be at the Harris site. We think that these groups developed, these extended family corporate groups developed because they were initial land holding families, and it was tied to irrigation. Now, I am standing on the Harris site in this picture. This is the farm field. It's still used today. There's irrigation canals that are used today and lots of farmland. I think you can see the cows out there. I spent days walking, much to the cows' delight. They're like, what in the world are you doing here? Days surveying out in those fields, looking to see if I could find any prehistoric evidence of prehistoric irrigation canals. I could not, but that's partly because it's been so disturbed from modern day farming. That if you go out there today, you'll see it, that it's still a farm field. So, but we're pretty convinced that they were doing irrigation agriculture down in that farmland. and that these extended family corporate groups really were the kind of lifeblood of that. They are wealthier households, wealthier in terms of amount of goods, in terms of the burials that we found from them, and Dr. Bastian has worked on some of that. And they were also, it looks like, specializing in craft production and ritual sponsorship. These extended family households, one of the ways that they were getting the buy-in from everybody was through sponsoring rituals in those kivas. Since this isn't a talk on Harris, I'm brushing over a lot of stuff, but we do have good evidence of all of this. This is one of the kivas that we excavated. Howie had excavated the largest kiva. This is an earlier great kiva, so this kiva dated to about the early to mid 800s. And we were able to excavate the center post, the hearth, and then part of the floor here. So we got some really good data on ritual activities, which is actually just coming out right now. We have a book chapter, and I'm revising an American Antiquity article on what was going on in here. So if you get interested, hopefully that'll be out soon. This is the one that Howie dug. This is Pitt House 10. It was ritually retired. It was used. The one that we dug, this is Pitt House 55. This was ritually retired in probably the late AD 800s. And then they immediately built this much larger great kiva that Howie dug. That was ritually retired in the mid to late 900s. Howie dug that with a team of horses. So that's how they removed all the filth. So we don't have a lot of data from that. To his credit, that was how they did removed big amounts of material at the time. But you can see the burn posts here, and we, unbeknownst to the people that had ritually retired this, we had discovered by the time we were digging at Harris that the center post holes of these great kivas were really important. They put a lot of materials in there when they retired. So we saw from this photo, Howie had not dug the center post hole. So we went back in and opened that up above the center post hole and excavated the center post hole, and found all of these really interesting ritual items. We also found that they had put these giant boulders on top of it, not thinking that pesky archaeologists would come in many, many years later and excavate it out. So we have a lot of information on how these kivas are ritually retired. What we do know from Harris is that the extended family household, after this was retired, it was burned and retired, the extended family household left Harris. They didn't stay there. And there's a small remnant population that stays in the late 900s. But that's what makes Harris so interesting, is that there's no Pueblo on top of it. We see this happen all up and down the Mimbres Valley, where these great kivas, these large great kivas are richly retired in the AD 900s. All of those other sites have Pueblos built on top of them. Harris does not. And so one of the things that I wanted to find out was, well, where did everybody go? And why did they leave Harris when they didn't leave other areas? I suspect, personally, and we're working on this right now, that it was a social collapse, essentially, that these extended family households, as I say, were really the lifeblood of it. When this was ritually retired and they moved, I think it was a split. I think that they just were like, no, we don't want to stay here. We aren't going to invest in continuing to live here. And so they do disperse out of there. The site is abandoned completely by about AD 1000, which makes it very, very different from what we're going to see elsewhere. So anyway, during all of this, I was by now the Pitt House person, right? And so the Forest Service approached me and said, hey, we have a site that's in danger. It's being eroded. Part of the site is being eroded. Would you consider coming and digging this pueblo? And I'm like, sure, why not? So this is Elk Ridge. It's at the northern end of the valley, right as it splits off and goes up. So here's the Mimbres River Valley. These are all the major Pueblo sites along the Mimbres River Valley. And then, so Elk Ridge is at the largest site at the north end, and then it splits off, and you get some other sites up in here that are on the Gila. But it is kind of the north end of the Mimbres Valley. And so this is the environment. So we started work here in response to the Forest Service request. And unfortunately, you can see right here, this is where we were working. And you can see the arroyo cut in here. So that's why we were working there, is the arroyo was starting to cut into that pueblo. The pueblo itself, thank God, is deeply, deeply buried, and is a big component of the north end is over here and completely covered by alluvium. So it's safe. So we just got the part that was eroding. You notice this here, I have a very, very sad member story to tell you. This was also where a big component of the pueblo was. We estimate that the pueblo was at least 200 rooms. It covered this whole area here. But you'll notice there are all kinds of scars there. Well, that's on private land. The area we were working on was in forest land. And in 1989, New Mexico passed a burial law that made it illegal to excavate burials. And so the landowner on the southern end, at that time, the landowner, it's now owned by the Archaeological Conservancy, but the guy that owned this land hired a bulldozer to come in and get the pots out so they could sell them before the burial law went into effect. And we have stories about this, this is what the south end of the site looks like. We have stories about this, that there were people lined up on the roadway bidding on pots. Now remember, these are burial pots. These are pots coming out of burials, and they were literally bidding on them as they came out. We've been able to get some information on some of these pots. Actually, the guy that owned this was a guy named Croteau, and his nephew, I think, Danielle could tell us better. Is it his nephew, Dylan, or his, anyway, one of his relatives, they still had a bunch of pots, not the really fancy ones. They sold all those, but they still had a bunch of pots, and they have returned those to the Mimbres Cultural Heritage Site. And Danielle Romero, who's doing her dissertation on the Elk Ridge pottery, is including some of those pots. We don't know the context of them like we know the context of ours, but certainly she's doing INAA sourcing on them and including them in her studies. So the good news about this part of the site is you can see how deeply buried the pueblo was. It was way down here. So even though he was bulldozing, he only got part of it. And there's still a ton that's intact there. And fortunately, it's now owned by the Archaeological Conservancy. So the intact parts of the pueblo, which include all of this land here, are pretty safe. So now, what we were asked to do is on the north end, that little area, you can see here, there was a pueblo wall that was eroding out. And so the Forest Service said, look, we're starting to see real damage to these pueblo rooms. Let's do something. And so he showed me, Chris Adams, the forest archaeologist, shows me that little part and says, see? And then he goes, oh, by the way, I need you to do all the way from here, that's that little rock sticking out, oh, all the way down to that fence line down there. So we were like, okay, this is not going to be one season of field work. And in fact, it was 4 seasons. I was not a Pueblo archaeologist. And so I was like, okay, sure, I'll do this. And so the first thing I did was get a co-director who is an absolute expert in Pueblo archaeology. This is Dr. Darrell Creel, who retired from UT Austin and has been involved in the project from day one when we started in there, thank goodness. So we started excavating along the edge here. There's Dr. Bastian right there. She is the bioarchaeologist for the project. And we excavated burials. Why we did that is because they had already found one that had been cut by the arroyo, and they were concerned about the fact that these burials were going to be eroded. And so that's why we had a project bioarchaeologist through the whole project. So we started excavating, and I'm going to tell you the results of what we excavated. We've excavated numerous rooms all along here. You can see what they would do is once we would finish one season, so that was 2015 was our first season, and we found this series of rooms, including this very large room with multiple burials. And I'm going to talk about lineage rooms in a little while. And this was one of them. And just to make us feel better about, because I'm not a staunch believer that you should excavate burials just randomly, but we had two things happen. One is we found, you can see how half the room was already eroded out. You can see where the arroyo cut hit here. And we found one burial that had literally been cut in half by the arroyo. So these were at big risks. These burials were at big risks of being eroded out. So this room had multiple burials, lots and lots and lots of remodeling. And then they had these smaller rooms that were a little bit later. So we began to get a taste. We still didn't really know what was going on there, but we began to get a taste of what we were in for. I always joke, little did we know when we dug half this room that was so complex. So in 2016, we continued on down the arroyo. We just so that's the forest archaeologist. We worked really closely. We had students, but we also worked really closely with Grant County Archaeological Society, with the volunteers. They have been on most of all my projects. They started out in Gila and Cantada and have worked with me, worked all through the years at Harris, and then we're out here. So if you see this big group, it's not all just students. It's sometimes a lot of volunteers as well. This was Aaron Woods, one of our former grad students. But in 2016, again, we continued on down the arroyo. And what we started to get during those excavations was a framework of how these pueblos were being organized. And I joke now that I next want to go dig an Anasazi Pueblo, because Anasazi Pueblos, you remember me screaming this, Dylan, one day when I was trying to figure out what in the world was going on. And I said, I just want to go dig a unit Pueblo, because Anasazi unit Pueblos are, there's the rooms, and then there's the trash midden, and then there's the little kiva. And you always know where you are. And in this, that's not how they were at all. It was like, oh, you want to come live here? Okay, here, we'll build a room. We'll remodel it, we'll change the vent, we'll put a door in. Oh, we don't like that door. We'll change the door, we'll move something else. And we were just, I was like, what in the world? Constantly, right guys? Constantly, what's going on? Is that the floor? I think it's the floor, it looks like the floor. Oh, yes, here's the hearth. Oh, they remodeled the hearth. So it was challenging archaeology, but really, really interesting. So what we were able to see through time, and we're still working on it, is how these households changed through time. There's Dr. Bastian right there. And so, for example, this had a much earlier room and then you see a later room, then they remodeled the hearth, and they would remodel the walls. So we're still working on that part. Jared, who is sitting here in the room right now, is doing some of the architectural analysis for his thesis to try to really pin down this whole sequence of how this community developed and how it changed through time. It's much more challenging than just putting mapping rooms on a map because there was so much change. One of the things that we found, which we were very excited about and are still very excited about, is in the first few seasons, we kept finding these remnants of adobe walls. Now, the early architecture in the Southwest is often what we call hakal, or wattle and daub. So basically, mud bricks. And we kept finding these little remnants of these adobe kind of wattle and daub kind of structures. And it was like, well, where are these coming from? They would always be subfloor. And so in 2017, we actually found a room, which it predates those later Pueblo rooms with these cobble adobe walls. These are cobble adobe walls. They're just river cobbles with flat stones on the top. But we found an adobe Pueblo room underneath the area where the cobble adobe Pueblos were. This actually was, again, because they never made things easy. The Pueblo, this adobe Pueblo room was underneath a remodeled Ramada area. And so after they abandoned this room, they built a Ramada that was tied to these rooms up here. So just very, very complex architecture. But the adobe Pueblo predates the cobble adobe, so we can kind of see the sequence. Now, what we were most excited about that year was there had been a debate throughout the Mimbres Valley about the transition from pit houses to Pueblos. And some people thought it was really fast. The Mimbres Foundation thought it was super fast, that you went from pit houses, you stopped building Pueblos, pit houses, you built Pueblos. Others, a guy especially named Harry Schaefer, who had worked in the Southern Valley at the Nan Ranch, he had evidence at Nan that there was a slower transition, that in fact, they would build Pueblos on top of pit houses, but that were connected. Well, everybody was like, no, well, we don't know about that. Maybe that's just an anomaly. And what we found, pay attention to this wall right in here, is we found a pit house underneath that adobe Pueblo. And the best part about all of it, shared walls. They reused, the adobe Pueblo reused this wall and this wall when they built the Pueblo room. So we see that transition, that in situ transition from pit house to Pueblo at Elk Ridge. And we're certain there are a bunch of pit houses at the south end of the site, the part that got looted, a bunch of pit houses there. So we're certain that this is continuous across the site. I was so excited, having dug pit houses for much of my career at that point. I was so excited when we found the pit house because it wasn't confusing. You could see all this adobe melt, and we'd been trying to figure out what was going on. And then we got to the pit house, and I'm like, oh, here's the hearth, here's the entryway, here's the center post. We knew exactly where to dig and what to look for. So, but as I say, one of the things that we've really struggled with at Elk Ridge is the fact that they did remodel so much. And we think this is really tied to the fact that these are corporate households. This is my house, this is my lineage. There are burials in the floors of these structures. This is my family, this is my lineage, and we're just gonna keep remodeling until we have to move because we can't do it anymore. And the house is structurally unsound. So you can just see there are vents, here's a blocked up doorway. There are so many episodes of change through time in these houses as the households grew, and then as they expanded, and then as they're retired toward the end. So, and then as I say, they took that Adobe Pueblo area and they made it into a ramada, an open area. So we began to get this idea that these households and their lineages were really important. And we knew that from other work that had been done in the Mimbres Valley, but we were still trying to figure out kind of what the role of these were. And I do want to stress that Nan Ranch was dug by Harry Schaefer and has really good data. A lot of the Pueblos had been excavated in the 30s by earlier archaeologists. And so we don't have, they didn't, for example, dig roof fall. They would just dig to the floor. So we have good data on the floor. But if you just dig the floor and you don't dig all these remnant walls and all of that, you just clear those out, it looks like these nice, neat Pueblo rooms. But when you dig them the way we dug them, and the way Harry Schaefer dug them, you get a very different idea of how these rooms were dynamic in response to family changes. So this is what it looks like if you just look at our map. But all of those rooms, so you can see this one, 3 rooms there, okay? And all of them show changes. This is the Pitt house. This is the Pueblo above it. Here's the Ramada. So we've really been working on the dynamics of these household changes. We have this really nice burned Ramada area that was on that last. So we think that the Ramada served these families, and there's to the south, which is where the looted Pueblo is. We think that this connects it up with some of those looted rooms as well. It's one of the things we're working with a guy out of New Mexico, Carl Lombach, and Dylan has worked on some of that material as well. They went in and did some salvage work on the southern half of the site, and so we're working with them as well to try to kind of reconstruct, see as much data as we can get from the south end of the site to kind of bring that to life. So the cool thing about this burned Ramada, and if you come in to my lab, you'll see that we have a little Gumby on our board, and actually the Gumby has a mask right now. We have him in a little mask, but this is why we have that Gumby there, because we called this a Gumby because he looked kind of like Gumby from the old cartoon. But actually what this is a goggle-eyed figure. And this vessel was probably about this big. And so we think it was a feasting vessel. It was found in the Ramada. We think that was one of the ways that they were bringing groups together, is in these Ramada areas and having feasts. And this is a big feasting vessel. Why it is so important is this is a very important symbol in the Mimbres Valley. Some people think it's Tlaloc, which is the rain god. There are a bunch of people doing iconography right now, but it does seem to have been a very important symbol to the Mimbres people. We have abundant evidence of ceramic production, some very, very well-made ceramics. So we know that they were producing ceramics at Elk Ridge and trading them throughout the Mimbres region. The other thing that we have evidence of is that they were raising turkeys. We have evidence of that from our work, and we have evidence of that from the work that was done in the south end. They had a lot of turkeys. We found turkey burials, and why we're calling them turkey burials is because they were intact all together, and so we don't think that they were raised, no evidence of cut marks. We don't think that they were raising them for food, but instead for feathers. And so and then they were exchanging them. We just had their DNA done, and Sean Dolan did out of New Mexico, did the DNA. He's doing this huge Mimbres study on turkeys, and they are domesticated. Ours are domesticated. The ones on the south end, he did some of the south end, they have a mix of both domesticated and wild. So, but ours are domesticated turkeys. This is a turkey pen that we found. You can see the plug right there. This is in that ramada where we had the Gumby vessel, this huge ramada with feasting, and then they had a turkey pen there too. So we think that one of the things they were doing, this is the north end of the Mimbres Valley. It's risky to do agriculture up there. Early frosts would have been an issue. And so one of the things that we think that they were doing is these families, these households, was hedging their bets by having other things that they could exchange, pottery, turkeys. And so they were kind of making up for the lack of large amounts of surplus agriculture. They could trade the surplus to the Pueblos in the south who were growing massive amounts of maize. They could trade the surplus or trade the turkeys and some of their pots to folks in the south and get the surplus maize. So we think it was one of the ways that they were hedging their bets. Okay, so far, and we're still finishing all of this up right now. This is a work in progress. So far, what we found is the role that yes, those corporate groups that we saw develop at the Harris site continued through time. And Harry Schaefer had been arguing this for years. We saw the Pueblo complexity of the Pueblo growing. The largest rooms that we excavated, the largest and most complex rooms at the site, had multiple burials. Dr. Bastian can talk about some of this. All ages buried over long periods of time. These appear to be the same things that Harry found at Nan, which are lineage rooms. These become important markers of ancestry and landholding through time. And we've got the exact same thing at Elk Ridge and at Nan, so at the north end, which means we probably have it all up and down through the valley. We don't have the fine-grained data in these other areas, but we certainly think that we have the same idea, same thing here. And we think that it's these important extended families, these landholding families, that were instrumental in the growth of the Pueblo. So one of the things that we're now looking at is what is the relationship of these households to one another. That's where Jared's work is coming in. And then what is their relationship to other Pueblo communities? What does the Elk Ridge community look like in the Mimbres world? And so that is ongoing right now. In 2019, right before COVID hit, that's my colleague, Roger Anion, we did some work at a site called Cottonwood. Cottonwood, it's a great example of how your mind can play tricks on you. Cottonwood has always been one of my absolute favorite Pueblo sites. It's about a mile away from Elk Ridge. It's just south, just right literally around the bend. You could walk there in a few minutes if you were a Mimbres person. Anyway, Cottonwood we thought was small, and we thought it was kind of a satellite of Elk Ridge. So we went and did investigations in 2019. We mapped it. We did surface collections, and it has about 100 rooms. So now one of the things that we're looking at is you've got 100 rooms, you've got a huge Pueblo at Elk Ridge, and a mile away you have 100 rooms. That's not the normal pattern that we usually see in the Mimbres area. So we're trying to figure out what is Cottonwood's relationship to Elk Ridge. Is that one big community? And one of the things we did this past summer was we went out and we mapped all of the detailed mapping of all of these, and we're doing a GIS study to try to figure out what the relationships of these sites are to each other. The other thing that we're looking at is this is The Bradsby site, which is a Pueblo site that appears to be related to Elk Ridge, is what rolled this. So this is Bradsby, Elk Ridge is behind it, down the ridge, and then Cottonwood is down the road that way. And you see this expanse of agricultural land. So one of the things that we're thinking of, Elk Ridge doesn't have that agricultural land right next to it, is that this is actually Elk Ridge's farmland, and that these other communities were part of Elk Ridge and part of the Elk Ridge community, and we're really farming this area. So it's one of the things we're exploring right now. The other thing we're looking at is community development. How did this community develop? We have that Pitt House to Pueblo transition that I showed you about, but that's a very late Pitt House. That Pitt House dates to the late 900s. So what about the rest of the Pitt House occupation? We know we have Pitt Houses on the south end that they found during the looting, but there's also, I'm standing on Elk Ridge here, there's also a huge three-circle phase Pitt House village on top of that ridge. It's called the three-circle site. It has no, so it's what the three-circle phase is named. It has no Pueblo component, and we think that they moved there. As Elk Ridge became more of a hub, that they left the three-circle site and came down and lived in at Elk Ridge. So we're also investigating that primarily through ceramics with that. Then the other thing that we're really looking at is what role the North had. And the North, I mean other Mogollon. If you go out of the Mimbres Valley and up into the foothills up in there, it's called the reserve area. It's a different Mogollon group. And I don't have enough time to talk about how we define these cultural groups, but they're still Mogollon. They still make the same kind of pottery. They still make, generally the architecture is the same, but they're a different branch of the Mogollon. And so one of the things that we're seeing at Elk Ridge is a lot of connection between the northern groups and our Elk Ridge occupants. We're primarily seeing it in ceramics. This has some northern influences on it. And in architecture, this is not a typical cobble adobe wall. So we're seeing some architectural changes. We are seeing the changes in pottery and architecture after we see a male. There's a male buried in one of the floors of the houses who is clearly not local. He has completely different pottery. He has head deformation. His morphology is very different. He's much taller than most of the local Mimbres. And so we think that his intermarriage into this group precipitated some fundamental changes in the community. So one of the things we're looking at is what is the influence of intermarriage in this community development. And finally, we're kind of looking at how this might relate to other Mimbres communities. So this past summer, my friend Marilyn, who is the lifeblood of the Grant County Archaeological Society, my student Danielle, and my dog Dixie, and I climbed to all of these sites in the area around Elk Ridge and mapped them with a GPS unit. And we're trying to see if there's any commonalities in the way that these Pitt House sites, we're standing on a big Pitt House site right now that's in this picture, that's abandoned, and then they moved down to a Pueblo site, much like what we think is going on at Elk Ridge. So we're trying to see if there's any commonalities amongst these different clusters of Pueblo communities. And if we can, this is going to be a long-term project, but if we can really tease out how these communities developed. And I will just give her a plug. She saw her first herd of deer ever. She chased them like crazy, and we're screaming, Dixie, Dixie, come back. We're standing there waiting, and then she comes back and she's like, Did you see that? Her whole body was shaking. She was so excited, but thank goodness she did come back. But she was so excited. So anyway, that is where we are right now. As I say, it's a work in progress. And I would welcome any questions or ideas from any of you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Roth. That was really, especially the turkeys. I had no idea. So we do have a question, Barb, online from Kara, and I can't remember where it was from. Something about different architectural styles. It was early on. Kara, did you want to say something about the question?
Oh yeah, it was the slide that you had with there was a burial that had been completely cut in half by the arroyo, and you had a slide that had it was the Pueblos, but they looked like they were two different styles because one was cobble built and the other
Yeah.
one, the walls looked like they were built with more angular slabs.
Right. Okay, let me find that. Oh, I didn't even talk about the turkey. I learned, you always learn something, right? Whenever you do anything. I learned, do you know you can age a turkey by the size of that? That little, I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, by the spur, you can measure the spur. So this was a 3-year-old turkey. I thought that was fascinating. Anyway, this one, Kara?
No, I think it was a little before that, but that kind of shows the same thing where you can see the rounded cobbles and then the more angular slabs.
Exactly, yeah. And that comes, at least as far as we can tell, that comes after this male moves in. So we think, we think, as in any kind of intermarriage in the past, that he moved in, but it wasn't just him, right? Then later on, it's like, oh, you know, some of my family. So we think that there were some northern folks that were moving into this area. So we do have some northern pottery. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, and Barb, we have a question from Ian. He has a question about the turkeys, the domesticated ones. Did they eat corn? And I'm going to add on to that, Barb. If you have a 3-year-old turkey, did they keep the turkeys and then just pluck their feathers every once in a while, like not kill them and pluck them all, but just kind of keep them alive and kind of pluck them?
That's what we think, because we have the turkey pen here, and it's really interesting because in the South, on the southern room block, they did, as I say, some salvage work, and they found one whole room. Carl Lombach has one whole room that they converted because they had a bunch of dung. We didn't find any dung. We did find some eggshells, but we didn't find any dung. But they had a bunch of dung in there, and so they converted an entire Pueblo room into a turkey pen. So we had this small, this was of course a remodeled room because that's what they did. We had this small turkey pen. So yes, Liam, we are thinking that that's exactly what they did. They kept them alive for a certain amount of years, and then eventually, either, we don't know if it was part of a ritual or what, that most of our turkeys, I will say, were headless. And so one of the things we're looking at is were they taking the heads, or do the heads just preserve less? But most of these turkeys were really, you dug one, Jared, they were really intact. And so if the head was gone, it seems weird that just the head would decay. So one of the things our working theory right now is that they were lopping off their heads and then burying them. So after a certain amount of time.
And did they thanks, Barbara, and that's really interesting. Did they, and from Ian, were they being fed corn, the domesticated ones?
So, and absolutely. That's one of the ways, Sean is, I don't want to take too much from Sean's research because he's just trying to get it published, but yes, they were being fed corn, so they were being raised there. Now, what I find most interesting is that in the South, we have, south end of the site, we have some non-domesticated. So were they bringing those guys in to keep the bloodline going, or what? why did they have some domesticated? Were those in the process of being domesticated? This one, this guy was hobbled. So his leg was broken. So we know that they were doing certain things, but he was domesticated because I thought he might be wild, and they hobbled him to keep him around. But he was actually he was quite large, and he was actually hobbled. So they were doing some very interesting things with the turkeys. But the big thing we think they were doing is raising them and trading them.
Very interesting. We don't have any more questions here on chat, Barb, but are there any questions you want to have in the room there with folks that are there with you?
Peter?
So a lot of the discussion's been around maize. Do you have any sense about the consumption of alcoholic, a maize beer, and whether that might align with an increasing social scale? Is raise the question of how do you bring together people at a larger social scale?
What a great question, Peter. At Elk Ridge, we don't have the great data that we do from Harris. At Harris, we have clear evidence that they were fermenting. And actually, one of those households that I talked about that was sponsoring rituals, one of the ways we know they were sponsoring rituals is that we find fermentation vessels in there. So they were fermenting, and the assumption is that they were fermenting maize beer. So we know that tradition is long-term. The interesting thing, I was just talking to Harry Schaefer last week, as a matter of fact, because he's always thought that at Nan, he's got great evidence at Nan that they were using maize corn beer, and I think they were absolutely doing that here. We just don't have the fermentation vessels, probably in the part that we dug. They just weren't there. But he's got these huge fermentation vessels. But one of the things he's found at Nan are wild grapes. So he's thinking that not only were they doing corn beer, but maybe a little bit of early wine. So, but he hasn't done any residue analysis to see if that's true. So, but yes, we absolutely think, we don't have the firm evidence at Elkridge that we do at Harris, but given the long-standing tradition of that we see in the valley, it's almost certain that was when they were having those feasts, when they were bringing those folks together. The other thing I didn't really talk about here, because we didn't excavate one, but they do have several kivas on the site, and we did remote sensing, and we think, I'm going to go back to the very beginning, we think that there is, based on our remote sensing, so there's a big classic period kiva down here on the south end that they excavated during the salvage work that was done there. And based on the remote sensing, it looks like there's another classic period kiva right here. Of course, the Forest Service, we couldn't find, the arroyo doesn't go anywhere near there, so we couldn't really find any reason to ask the Forest Service to let us dig that. So, but certainly the remote sensing points to the fact that there's a kiva there. So there's rituals going on as well that are linking those households. And I'm sure the consumption of maize beer is part of that.
And Ian had a question about agaves with the fermentation, and we'll probably wrap it up with that, Barb. We have 3 minutes.
You know what? For a long time we thought that it was agave. The thing is, we don't find any roasting pits. So we spent a fortune at Harris on residue analysis on our fermented vessels and came back absolutely inconclusive. So we don't, the answer to Ian is we don't know. But the fact that we don't have any big roasting pits, which you would need to roast the hearts and then ferment them, suggests that maybe it's not, but we're still open to figuring that out.
Terrific, thank you. And we have 2 minutes. Any brief questions anyone have in that room there? No other chats? Otherwise, we'll wrap up.
Rosina has a question.
Yeah, so back to the male burial, that like the super tall man that was found. Is there any possible linkage to Chaco Canyon and like that room that has those?
No, that's a great question. No, he's clearly, just based on the pottery that we found with him, and the pottery that we found in other parts of the room with him, he's clearly from the reserve area. He's a reserve Mobile person.
Terrific. And on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Roth. Big hand for coming and sharing your work with us. And we will finish our pro sem now. And next week we have, next Monday, we have Dr. Janine Bao. We hope to see everyone then. And very much good to see everyone. And thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Did you have a question?
I did. I was wondering if there were any signs of ritual with the turkey burials.
Yeah, that's a great question. We think that they were ritual burials just because they were intact.